I had to go, well, predestination. Of course, we do get some bad jokes out of it. Like the story of the good Calvinist who tripped and fell coming into church and was heard to mutter, well, thank goodness that's over. I know, it's pretty lame. More often, we struggle with the dual reality of the sovereignty of God and the free will of human beings. If God is truly sovereign, supporting and directing the world, my life, and each new day, then God has a plan for my life and it will happen. Even more, God's plan is destined to affect my eternal salvation. On the other hand, God has given us the gift of freedom, even the freedom to reject God. And discussions on predestination usually go back and forth between these 2 points, often generating more heat than light, and leaving us caught between the paradox of 2 conflicting truths. And the struggle doesn't end there. It's quite clear that Calvin believed in what we often call double predestination. That is, he believed that God destined some for eternal salvation and some for eternal damnation. Faced with the reality of folk who resist any overtures by God, who turn their backs on God no matter what, double predestination is a logical way to maintain God's sovereignty in the face of human intransigence. Even in the midst of human rejection, God is still in charge. It is logical. And there are hints of such things in statements like, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. You know, if Pharaoh won't obey God's command to let my people go, then he was only acting as God intended. However, it also flies in the face of Jesus' image of God as the woman turning her house inside out until she finds that last coin. She won't give up until it's found. The elder John, who wrote Revelation, sees the New Jerusalem standing with 12 gates, open day and night, to every direction of the compass. And in Revelation, even the misguided kings of the earth find their way to its welcome. This passage of Paul's is the only place in the Bible where we find anyone talking about predestination. It's hard for Paul that so many of his own people, the Jews, rejected Jesus. But Paul is very clear that God has not rejected them. My own conclusion is that Calvin got caught by his own logic and by the hard political realities of his own time that roiled up during the Reformation period. I choose to set aside Calvin's rigidity for Paul's insight that all creation, the world of nature as well as human beings, are on a course for redemption. In God's own time, the entire created order will stand before the throne of God and acknowledge God's sovereignty. Now, much as I tremble to disagree with such an extraordinary mind, I do think Calvin is wrong about double predestination. But I do like something else he says. The doctrine of election and predestination is useful, necessary, and most sweet. Ignorance of it impairs the glory of God and plucks up humility by the root, begets and fosters pride. Well, ignorance of predestination may foster pride in our own certainty of salvation, but to embrace God's power over our lives certainly develops humility. You know, one of the problems Calvin faced in his day was that the church had taken unto itself the power of salvation. Jesus had given the Apostle Peter, and therefore his successors in the church, the keys to the kingdom. In any medieval statue that you see, you always see Peter standing there with this key. And if you were excommunicated, remember there's only one church at that time, it wasn't just that you were shut out of the church, you were shut off from God for all eternity. It was a terrible thing to have happen, and it gave tremendous power to the medieval church. Calvin insisted that it wasn't the church that controls your salvation, but God. And that was a great insight and a gift to ordinary folk. Well, it's not only the medieval church that tries to control salvation. Every one of us, let's face it, falls into the trap of thinking that we can earn our way into God's grace. You know how it goes. You've heard people say it. If I live a good life, surely that ought to count for something. Or something happens and there's the, okay, God, you owe me one. When we truly understand that our lives, the world, and all eternity belong to God, then we remember that it's not God who owes us, but we who owe God. God has planned for us to live in God's love now and always. And it's not something we've earned. It is certainly not something we deserve. It's a gift. And that keeps us humble. Which takes us to another of Calvin's points. The doctrine of predestination establishes the certainty of salvation and peace of conscience. Do people today worry about their salvation as much as they once did? You know, frankly, I don't think so. But we do worry about a lot of things. And knowing that God has predestined us for good means we don't have to worry about things in the same way. Remember what I read as we started. Paul prefaces his statement about predestination by saying, "We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose." Now that doesn't mean that things always work out the way we want them, or on the time schedule that we have in mind. But it does mean that when the hard times come, and they do for everyone, we can trust that God has predestined us and the world itself to work for God's good intent. Finally, a story that comes from a little book written by a friend of mine from the Movable Feast. The Movable Feast is a group of ministers that I used to go away with every January. We do lectionary study together. I first knew Michael Lindvall when we were both serving churches on Long Island. He's now pastor of Brick Presbyterian Church in New York City, and the author of a delightful little book, The Good News from North Haven. It tells about this little town in Minnesota and its pastor, the Reverend David Battles. In this particular chapter, Minnie McDowell is dying and has summoned the pastor. She has something to get off her chest, but she asks her husband Angus to tell the awful deed. "David," Angus began, "you remember that I was chair of the pulpit nominating committee that called you to be our pastor 4 years ago." I remembered. We received 28 dossiers from ministers. We read them all and narrowed the choice down to 2, you and the Reverend Harwick Benson of Indianapolis. We invited both you and Mr. Benson to visit North Haven and listen to both of you preach up in Wilmar. It came back to me as though it were yesterday. A hot day in June, a brand new pulpit robe from Bentley and Simon, my champion fits-all sermon, my voice cracking during what was meant to be a thunderous conclusion. After it was over, I made my peace with the prospect of settling for a position even less desirable than North Haven, Minnesota. What elation, what affirmation, when a simple, handwritten note came 4 days later, postmarked North Haven, Minnesota. There was not a heading, only a date, and then, "Dear Sir, we are most pleased to inform you." "David," Angus went on as his eyes shifted from me to his wife. "Minnie was secretary to our committee. She typed up all the letters. She typed up one to Reverend Benson and one to you. Somehow they got in the wrong envelopes. Mr. Benson got your letter, and you got Mr. Benson's." The story goes on a bit, but at the end, the pastor, David Battles, reflects, "I know that so much has come to me in life I did not search out, did not choose, but rather found by chance and accepted by grace. The will of God is an infinitely intricate weaving of incidents and accidents, plans and providence. Sometimes it works through us, sometimes in spite of us. But in all things, it can work for good. Thanks be to God. Amen.